The morning sun cast long shadows across the military training ground as soldiers lined up for their daily shooting practice. Among them stood a woman who seemed completely out of place. She wore an ill-fitting uniform that appeared borrowed rather than issued. Her hair pulled back in a simple ponytail that had already begun to come loose. Her name was Sarah Chen, and she had arrived at the base 3 days ago as part of a civilian marksmanship program that the military had reluctantly agreed to host. The other trainees were mostly young men with military aspirations or experienced hunters looking to improve their skills. Sarah worked as a librarian in a small town 2 hours away from the base. She had signed up for the program almost by accident, filling out the application form while helping a patron who couldn't complete it himself due to poor eyesight. When the confirmation letter arrived weeks later, she had completely forgotten about it. General Marcus Rodriguez watched from the observation deck as the instructor explained the day's exercises. He had been running this base for 15 years and had seen thousands of recruits and trainees pass through. The general prided himself on being able to spot natural talent within minutes of watching someone handle a weapon. Today's group looked typical, except for the woman who kept adjusting her stance awkwardly and seemed more interested in the birds flying overhead than the weapons demonstration. The instructor, Sergeant Williams, began calling names for individual assessments. Each trainee would fire 5 rounds at targets placed at different distances, starting with the closest at 50 yards and working back to 200 yards. The exercise was designed to test basic accuracy and weapon handling rather than advanced marksmanship skills. The first few trainees performed as expected. Some showed promise, others struggled with the basics, but all approached the firing line with either confidence or nervous determination. When Sarah's name was called, she walked forward with what appeared to be complete disinterest, as if she were being asked to shelve books in the biography section rather than handle a military rifle. Sergeant Williams handed her the weapon and began his standard safety briefing. Sarah nodded politely but seemed distracted by a conversation between 2 soldiers near the equipment shed. The sergeant had to repeat the instructions about sight alignment twice before she appeared to be listening. Several of the other trainees exchanged glances and barely suppressed smirks. General Rodriguez found himself leaning forward slightly as he watched the woman take her position. There was something about her casual demeanor that bothered him, though he couldn't quite identify what it was. In his experience, people who treated firearms with such apparent indifference were usually either completely inexperienced or hiding something significant about their background. Sarah raised the rifle to her shoulder with movements that seemed clumsy and uncertain. She spent several seconds adjusting her grip and stance while the instructor offered corrections that she appeared to ignore. The general noticed that despite her seemingly awkward positioning, she had actually achieved a textbook shooting stance without appearing to try. The first target was a standard bullseye at 50 yards, an easy distance for anyone with basic shooting experience. Sarah took aim with what looked like random pointing rather than careful sight alignment. She pulled the trigger with a sharp, quick motion that made Sergeant Williams wince, expecting a wild shot that would miss the target entirely. The bullet struck dead center. Sergeant Williams blinked and looked through his binoculars to confirm what he had seen. The other trainees stopped their quiet conversations and turned to look at Sarah, who was already adjusting her position for the second shot, as if the first had been pure luck. The second target was placed at 100 yards. Sarah's approach remained exactly the same. Casual, almost careless positioning followed by what appeared to be hasty aim and a quick trigger pull. The bullet hit within an inch of the center ring. General Rodriguez stood up from his chair and moved closer to the railing of the observation deck. He had witnessed thousands of shooters over his career, and he knew the difference between luck and skill. What he was seeing didn't fit either category. The woman's technique appeared fundamentally wrong according to everything he had been taught and everything he had taught others, yet her results were undeniably accurate. The third target was at 150 yards, a distance where even experienced shooters needed to pay careful attention to wind conditions and breathing techniques. Sarah approached this shot exactly as she had the others, with the same casual disregard for proper form that had characterized her previous attempts. This time, however, something different happened. As she raised the rifle, a strong gust of wind swept across the range, causing the flags to snap loudly and several trainees to pause their own shooting. Sarah held her position for a moment longer than before, though she still appeared to be looking at something other than her target. When she fired, the bullet struck the exact center of the bullseye. The range fell silent except for the sound of the wind and the distant voices of soldiers conducting other training exercises. Sergeant Williams lowered his binoculars and stared at Sarah, who had already begun walking toward the final firing position as if nothing unusual had occurred. The fourth target stood at 200 yards, the maximum distance for the day's exercise. At this range, factors like ammunition quality, wind speed, and minute differences in Rifle 0 became significant variables. Even skilled marksmen required several practice shots to achieve consistent accuracy at this distance. General Rodriguez had unconsciously moved to the very edge of the observation deck, his hands gripping the railing as he watched Sarah take her final position. Around him, other instructors and observers had begun to gather, drawn by word that something unusual was happening on the range. Sarah's approach to the final shot appeared identical to her previous attempts. She raised the rifle with the same seemingly careless movements, spent the same brief moment acquiring her target, and prepared to fire with the same quick, sharp motion that had preceded her earlier success. But just as her finger began to squeeze the trigger, she paused. For the first time since beginning the exercise, she appeared to be genuinely concentrating on the task at hand. The casual expression on her face was replaced by something that looked almost like focus, though it lasted for only a few seconds. The shot echoed across the range, and every person present turned their attention to the distant target. Through binoculars and spotting scopes, they could see a small hole that appeared to be positioned exactly in the center of the bullseye. But at this distance, precise assessment required confirmation from the range safety officer who had walked out to inspect the target. The radio crackled to life with the range officer's voice. Perfect center hit. Repeat, perfect center on target 4. General Rodriguez felt something he had not experienced in many years of military service. Complete surprise. He had just witnessed shooting that defied explanation, performed by someone who appeared to have no business holding a rifle, much less firing one with precision that would impress Olympic-level marksmen. As Sarah walked back from the firing line, she handed the rifle to Sergeant Williams with the same polite disinterest she had shown throughout the entire exercise. She thanked him for his instruction and began walking toward the group of trainees who were preparing for their turn at the targets. The general found himself staring after her, his mind racing through possible explanations for what he had just witnessed. Military training, police background, competitive shooting experience. None of these seemed to fit with the woman's demeanor and apparent unfamiliarity with military protocols. He realized that in 15 years of command, he had never encountered anything quite like this. Sarah Chen had just demonstrated shooting skills that surpassed most of his trained soldiers while appearing completely uninterested in the process. The general knew he needed to understand what he had just seen, but as he watched the unremarkable woman rejoin the group of trainees, he had no idea where to begin looking for answers. General Rodriguez spent the rest of that morning reviewing training schedules and trying to focus on routine administrative tasks. But his mind kept returning to what he had witnessed on the shooting range. By lunchtime, he had made a decision that went against his usual policy of maintaining distance from civilian trainees. He needed to speak with Sarah Chen. He found her sitting alone at a picnic table near the mess hall, eating a sandwich she had brought from home while reading a paperback novel. The other trainees had formed small groups and were discussing their morning performance with the animated enthusiasm typical of people experiencing military training for the first time. Sarah appeared completely disconnected from these conversations, as absorbed in her book as she had been disinterested in the shooting exercise. The general approached her table with the measured stride he used when addressing subordinates. But as he drew closer, he found himself uncertain about how to begin the conversation. His usual commanding presence seemed inappropriate for questioning a civilian librarian about her unexpected marksmanship abilities. Sarah looked up from her book as his shadow fell across the table. She marked her place with a receipt and smiled politely, the same expression she had worn when thanking Sergeant Williams for his instruction. There was nothing in her demeanor to suggest she was aware that her performance had been anything other than ordinary. The general introduced himself and asked if he could join her. Sarah nodded and gestured to the empty bench across from her. closing her book but keeping one finger between the pages to hold her place. She seemed prepared for a brief, polite conversation before returning to her reading. General Rodriguez found himself struggling with how to phrase his questions. His direct military communication style felt inappropriate, but he had no experience with casual conversation about extraordinary shooting performance. He began by asking about her background with firearms, expecting to uncover some hidden history of competitive shooting or military family connections. Sarah explained that she had never owned a gun and had only fired one twice before in her life, both times at a county fair shooting gallery where her nephew had wanted to win a stuffed animal. She had helped him aim and had won the prize on her second attempt, but she described this as simple luck rather than any particular skill. The general pressed further, asking about her family background and hobbies, searching for any connection to shooting sports or military service. Sarah's answers revealed a completely ordinary life centered around her work at the library, caring for her elderly mother, and a small garden where she grew vegetables and herbs. She had signed up for the marksmanship program, she explained, because the library was participating in a community outreach initiative and she had volunteered to represent them. As they talked, General Rodriguez began to notice details about Sarah that had escaped his attention during the morning's shooting exercise. Despite her casual demeanor, she possessed an unusual quality of stillness that made her seem completely present in each moment. When she listened to his questions, she appeared to be giving them her complete attention. Yet she maintained the same relaxed attitude that had characterized her approach to the shooting targets. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Sergeant Williams, who approached with obvious excitement and a folder of paperwork under his arm. He had spent his lunch break reviewing the morning's targets and calculating scores, and he wanted to share his findings with the general. Sarah's performance had not only been perfect, but had achieved a level of precision that exceeded the capabilities of the standard training rifles being used. The grouping of her shots was so tight that if the same level of accuracy could be maintained under various conditions, it would qualify her for national-level competitive shooting teams. Sergeant Williams had also reviewed the video footage from the range cameras, hoping to understand Sarah's technique well enough to incorporate it into future training programs. However, the recordings had only deepened the mystery. Frame-by-frame analysis showed that Sarah's shooting stance and grip were inconsistent with proven marksmanship methods, yet her results were undeniably superior. Sarah listened to this discussion with the polite attention she might give to a patron, asking about library services for a research project that didn't particularly interest her. When Sergeant Williams finished his excited explanation, she thanked him for his analysis and mentioned that she hoped the information would be useful for training other participants. General Rodriguez realized that Sarah genuinely did not understand the significance of what she had accomplished. In her mind, she had simply completed an assigned task as requested, and the enthusiasm of the military personnel was puzzling, but not particularly important to her. The afternoon training session was scheduled to include more advanced exercises, including moving targets and shooting from different positions. General Rodriguez decided to observe these sessions personally, hoping to gain more insight into Sarah's abilities. The moving target exercise used clay discs launched from different angles and distances, designed to test reaction time and tracking skills. Most civilian participants found this exercise significantly more challenging than stationary target shooting, and even experienced hunters often struggled with the timing and coordination required. Sarah approached the moving targets with the same casual attitude that had characterized her morning performance. She held the shotgun with a grip that looked improvised rather than trained, and her stance remained relaxed even as the targets began launching in rapid succession. The first clay disc arced across the range in a high, slow trajectory that gave shooters ample time to track and lead the target. Sarah raised her weapon and fired with what appeared to be minimal aiming time. The clay disc disintegrated in a cloud of orange fragments. The second target followed a faster, more horizontal path that required precise timing and accurate prediction of the target's movement. Sarah's shot connected perfectly, destroying the target at the optimal point in its flight path. As the exercise continued, the targets became increasingly difficult. Launched from multiple positions with varying speeds and angles, Sarah destroyed each one with what appeared to be effortless accuracy, though her technique remained fundamentally different from anything taught in military or civilian shooting programs. General Rodriguez found himself moving closer to the firing line, trying to understand how Sarah was achieving such results. He had spent decades studying marksmanship and training thousands of soldiers, but he could not identify the source of her accuracy. Her shooting appeared to be guided by intuition rather than technique, as if she were responding to information that was not available to other shooters. The most challenging part of the afternoon exercise involved shooting from prone, kneeling, and standing positions while engaging targets that appeared at random intervals. This exercise tested not only shooting accuracy, but also the ability to quickly transition between positions while maintaining weapon control. Sarah completed these transitions with movements that looked clumsy and inefficient, yet she managed to engage each target successfully, regardless of her body position or the speed required to acquire the target. Her shots connected with the same precision she had demonstrated throughout the day, even when fired from positions that should have made accuracy nearly impossible. By the end of the afternoon session, word of Sarah's performance had spread throughout the base. Officers and enlisted personnel found reasons to pass by the training area, hoping to catch a glimpse of the civilian shooter who was outperforming their best marksman. General Rodriguez realized that he was witnessing something that had no precedent in his military experience. Sarah Chen was demonstrating shooting abilities that transcended normal human limitations, yet she remained completely unaware of the extraordinary nature of her performance. As the day's training concluded and the participants prepared to leave, the general knew that he could not simply let Sarah return to her library job without understanding what he had observed. However, he also understood that traditional military investigation methods would be inappropriate for dealing with a civilian who had done nothing wrong and who appeared to possess abilities that she herself did not recognize or understand. He watched Sarah pack her small bag and prepare to drive back to her hometown, knowing that he would need to find a way to continue investigating this mystery without alarming her or disrupting her apparently peaceful life. The general had encountered many unusual situations during his military career, but none had left him feeling as unsettled and curious as his day spent observing the unremarkable woman who could shoot with impossible precision. 3 weeks after Sarah's visit to the military base, General Rodriguez found himself driving through the small town where she worked, having convinced himself that a personal investigation was necessary for national security reasons. In reality, his curiosity had grown into an obsession that was affecting his ability to concentrate on his regular duties. The town was exactly as unremarkable as Sarah herself had appeared. Main Street consisted of a few dozen businesses, including a hardware store, a diner, 2 churches, and the public library where Sarah spent her days. The general parked across from the library and spent several minutes observing the building, trying to understand how someone with such extraordinary abilities could exist in such an ordinary environment. The library was a small brick building that had clearly been constructed in the 1962 and had received minimal updates since then. Through the large front windows, he could see Sarah at the circulation desk, helping an elderly man with what appeared to be a computer problem. She wore a simple dress and cardigan that made her look even more unremarkable than she had in the borrowed military uniform. General Rodriguez entered the library with no clear plan for how to approach Sarah without revealing his ongoing investigation into her background. He had spent the previous weeks making discreet inquiries through military intelligence channels, searching for any information about Sarah Chen that might explain her shooting abilities. The investigation had revealed exactly what Sarah had told him during their conversation. She had lived in the same town for her entire life, working at the library for 8 years after graduating from the state university with a degree in English literature. Her employment history, educational background, and personal associations showed no connections to military organizations, shooting sports, or any activities that might have provided advanced firearms training. Sarah looked up from the computer as the general approached the circulation desk. She recognized him immediately and smiled with the same polite friendliness she had shown at the military base. She asked if he was visiting the area and whether she could help him find anything specific in their collection. The general had prepared a cover story about researching local history for a military museum project, but as he began to explain his presence, he found himself genuinely interested in the library and its resources. Sarah guided him to the local history section and provided several books about the area's involvement in various military conflicts. As he browsed through the historical materials, General Rodriguez observed Sarah interacting with other library patrons. She helped a young mother find picture books for her children, assisted a high school student with research for a term paper, and provided technical support for several elderly visitors who were struggling with the public computers. In every interaction, Sarah displayed the same quality of focused attention that he had noticed during their conversation at the base. She seemed to be completely present with each person, giving them her full attention regardless of how simple or complex their requests might be. Yet she maintained the same relaxed, unhurried attitude that had characterized her approach to the shooting exercises. The general spent 2 hours in the library, ostensibly researching local military history but actually observing Sarah and trying to understand how her extraordinary abilities might manifest in her everyday work environment. He found no evidence of anything unusual in her behavior or interactions with others. As closing time approached, General Rodriguez realized that his investigation was not providing any answers to the questions that had brought him to the town. Sarah's shooting performance remained as inexplicable as it had been on the day he first witnessed it. He approached the circulation desk to return the books he had been using and to thank Sarah for her assistance. As they talked, he mentioned that he had been impressed by the quality of the library's local history collection and asked if she had been responsible for developing those resources. Sarah explained that she had indeed organized the historical materials, working with local families and organizations to preserve documents and photographs that might otherwise have been lost. She described this work with the same quiet enthusiasm she brought to all her library duties, taking obvious pride in helping preserve the community's heritage. The general asked if she had encountered any particularly interesting stories during her historical research. Sarah mentioned several local families who had distinguished themselves in military service, including one man who had earned the Medal of Honor during World War II, and another who had been a sniper in Vietnam. As she talked about these local military heroes, General Rodriguez noticed a subtle change in Sarah's demeanor. She seemed more engaged than usual, and her descriptions of their service records included details that suggested extensive research into military history and combat tactics. When he commented on her knowledge of military matters, Sarah explained that she had become interested in military history through her work with the local historical society. She had spent considerable time interviewing elderly veterans and their families, learning about their experiences, and helping to preserve their stories for future generations. The general realized that Sarah's casual familiarity with firearms and military procedures might have developed through her historical research rather than any direct training or experience. Her work with veteran interviews could have provided extensive exposure to detailed descriptions of combat techniques, weapons handling, and marksmanship methods. However, this explanation still did not account for her extraordinary shooting performance. Knowledge about firearms and shooting techniques, even detailed theoretical knowledge, could not explain the level of precision she had demonstrated on the military range. As the library prepared to close, Sarah asked if the general's research had been helpful for his museum project. He assured her that it had been very valuable and mentioned that he might need to return for additional research in the future. Sarah offered to help him identify other local resources that might be useful for his project, including elderly residents who had military experience and might be willing to share their stories. Her genuine enthusiasm for helping with historical research made the general feel guilty about the deceptive nature of his visit. As he prepared to leave, General Rodriguez found himself facing a decision that would determine how he proceeded with his investigation. He could continue his discreet inquiries and observations, hoping to eventually understand the source of Sarah's abilities, or he could be honest with her about what he had witnessed and ask for her cooperation in understanding the mystery. The choice was complicated by his growing realization that Sarah's extraordinary shooting performance might be connected to qualities that made her an exceptional librarian and community member. Her ability to focus completely on each task, her intuitive understanding of what people needed, and her talent for preserving and organizing information all seemed to be expressions of the same underlying capabilities that had enabled her perfect marksmanship. General Rodriguez left the library that evening with more questions than answers, but with a deeper appreciation for the complexity of the mystery he was trying to solve. Sarah Chen was not simply a civilian with unusual shooting skills, but a person whose extraordinary abilities were integrated into every aspect of her apparently ordinary life. The drive back to the military base gave him time to consider the implications of his observations. If Sarah's abilities were as comprehensive as they appeared to be, she might represent a type of human potential that had not previously been recognized or studied. The question was whether this potential could be understood, developed, or replicated for military purposes. But as he thought about Sarah's genuine kindness toward the library patrons and her dedication to preserving local history, the general also wondered whether any attempt to exploit her abilities would be ethical or appropriate. Some mysteries, he realized, might be better left unsolved, especially when the people at their center were living productive, meaningful lives, without needing to understand or explain their own extraordinary capabilities. The general's investigation had begun with military curiosity about exceptional marksmanship skills, but it had evolved into something much more complex. He had discovered a person whose abilities challenged his understanding of human potential, but who seemed completely unaware of her own extraordinary nature. The question of what to do with this knowledge would require careful consideration of both military interests and basic human dignity. As he reached the base that evening, General Rodriguez realized that his encounter with Sarah Chen had changed his perspective on both military training and human capabilities in ways he was still trying to understand. The unremarkable woman who had stepped back from the shooting line with perfect scores had opened questions that might take years to fully explore and understand.